This is the third and the last part of a 3-part series on truth, at least an aspect of truth. Each part is about a basic element in the Christian life and sort of a call to make a personal decision for oneself. This third part is titled Measuring Your Days. It is wise to not allow fear to influence you in the many ways it tries to. May Christians be aware of this. Be unafraid of speaking what God wants you to speak. It is up to each how they choose to handle the truth. The truth itself is not accountable for if it is received or not. Each person who hears it is accountable. The truth does not seek to bind, but to release and set free. It is deception that seeks to bind, hide, manipulate, and control. May God's people run to the truth, to the light, and not run away from it. May we receive it and embrace it for all the good that it is and does. Walk with God in utter truth and humility. Truth and humility. Let these things not be compromised, not traded. It is never a good trade. Value is only lost, not gained in such a trade. Even so, much will be offered in trade for truth and humility. Much indeed. Stay the course, measure your days, knowing this earthly life is temporal, which puts into perspective both its irrelevance and absolute importance at the same time. I trust you know what I mean. Take God's hand in yours and go on with Him in faith and fortitude. Teach us to number our days and recognize how few they are. Help us to spend them as we should. Lord, help me to realize how brief my time on earth will be. Help me to know that I am here for but a moment more. I said to myself, I'm going to quit complaining. I'll keep quiet, especially when the ungodly are around me. But as I stood there silently, the turmoil within me grew to the bursting point. The more I mused, the hotter the fires inside. Then at last I spoke and pled with God. Lord, help me to realize how brief my time on earth will be. Help me to know that I am here for but a moment more. My life is no longer than my hand. My whole lifetime is but a moment. My whole lifetime is but a moment to you. Proud man, frail as breath, a shadow, and all his busy rushing ends in nothing. He heaps up riches for someone else to spend. And so, Lord, my only hope is in you. And that's the message. That's the message I have written out. Do I have anything else to add to that? I think the general topic of that message, other than it being about some aspect of truth, was about measuring your days. Measuring your days. I think that might be easier to do, to measure your days when either you get a little bit older or you have some event or issue in your life that might be life-threatening, or where you almost lost your life, or perhaps if you have a chronic illness. I think these things that I just listed can make a person think about that they won't live forever on this earth. I mean, we all know that already, right? Everyone's gonna die, but I think having one or more of those things that I just listed happen to you, or if they are currently happening to you, can make a person more, tend to make a person think about how many days they have left to live this earthly life. But I guess my point is, even if you haven't had one of those things happen to you, or if they're not currently happening to you, it is wise to measure your days nonetheless. And remember that this earthly life is temporal, so live it in such a way where it is not wasted. Where I'm trying to remember now, and I hope I'm not wrong, but I believe, is it at Judgment Day? At some point, I believe in the Bible, it says when the Lord's judging each person, something about wood, hay, and stubble being burned up, and what will remain. Will anything remain when the sum of your life and what you did with it is tested with fire? Am I wrong about that? I'm really trying hard to remember that. It's been a long time since I read that part, but each of us will account to the Lord for what we did while we're here. And I don't mean that to be a heavy burden on a person's shoulders, because it kind of sounds like it, but I mean, at least be aware. At least be aware of it, so you have a chance to live this life for the Lord. Sometimes when this life is so intense, or if you get distracted, it can feel like this temporal life is basically all there is. I think a person can lose sight of or forget eternity for a little while. I think especially we as Christians have to understand that this earthly life is very short compared to eternity. So let's live it as the Lord would want us to, because that is the best way you can live this life. I don't know if I referred to this in the past in some other video, but I think a telling question to ask someone is to ask them what their definition of success is. I find that an interesting question to ask a Christian, especially. What is their definition of success in their life? What would make their life the most successful it could be? What is that for them? I think that's very telling. My answer to that is success in my life would be that God's will is done in it. So when you have that as your utmost goal, you will want to live it with purpose, not just floating around aimlessly, not loving self and pleasure more than what God wants. Does that make sense? I'm not saying there isn't any pleasure at all, and that you as a person are not considered in the scope of God's will. I am saying for the Christian, this earthly life is not to be lived for themselves alone. So where am I going with this? I'm going to a point, which is measure your days and live it in a way that will please the Lord. The bottom line, I guess, that's live it in such a way that will please the Lord. And I don't mean to be harsh, but if you aren't living that way as a professed Christian, I don't know what you're doing living as a professed Christian. If you are not a Christian and do not intend to be, then I would not recommend trying to live this life selflessly. If a person is not and will not be a Christian, no matter what. If, for example, if I wasn't a Christian, and this earthly life was all I had, and that some kind of afterlife was some unknown, or hell, and this earthly life was all there was for me, I would try to enjoy and get out of it for myself everything that I could. This is all I got. So why not try your best to make so-called heaven on earth for yourself, and everything can serve you and make you feel good and make you happy. That would make sense to me. The only difference is if someone is actually a Christian and they're living for something other than themselves. There is I think it was Paul was talking in the Bible. Something about how if we had, as Christians, if we were hoping in nothing, if there was no hope for life after this earthly life, and we were living in this sacrificial type of way for nothing, then I think he said something like we would be the most pitiable of all creatures, because we would be doing this for nothing. And the point is, we're not doing it for nothing, we're doing it for something eternal, an eternal future. And not just that, but for God, our God. So I mean, I could keep talking about this at length, but one of the main points of this message was to measure your days. Measure your days. And no, I'm mainly speaking to Christians. I'm not really talking to unbelievers, as most of these videos are. I'm not really talking to unbelievers, but remember that this earthly life is temporal, and it's short in comparison to eternity, that's for sure. And each of us will face the Lord and account for what we did here, and if we loved Him and obeyed Him or not. I think part of living according to God's will is part of what I said in the message. For instance, being unafraid of speaking what God wants you to speak, and to not allow fear to influence you in the many ways it tries to. Now, to me, that sounds fairly simple. To not be afraid of speaking what God wants you to speak, and to not allow fear to influence you in the many ways it tries to. I believe that both those things would be according to God's will. God tells us not to fear, and He also does not give us a spirit of fear, but of what? Of power, of love, and of a sound mind. Furthermore, speaking what God wants you to speak is part of obedience, so I believe that would fall under God's will for you. It's simple, but it can also be not easy to speak what God wants you to speak and not be afraid. I guess my main point is, if you are afraid of speaking what God wants you to speak, but He wants you to speak it, okay, you might be afraid, but still obey. That's the main point out of that. Ultimately, it's best not to fear, period, but the main point is to not allow fear to actually cause you to disobey and not do what the Lord wants you to do. And in the message I said that we should walk with God in utter truth and humility. Again, this trio on truth, it was about a few other things, but throughout this trio, this 3-part series, was a vein of truth throughout, was running throughout. The first part was about a choice. The second part was about loving the truth. And so, walk with God in utter truth and humility. I said, truth and humility, let these things not be compromised, not be traded. It is never a good trade. Value is only lost, not gained in such a trade. Yes, there's a lot of things you can trade truth and humility for. You can trade it for pride, and you can trade it for lies if you want, but that's not a good trade. You're going to lose something. I say, value is only lost, not gained in such a trade. Even so, much will be offered in trade for truth and humility. Much indeed, yes, much will be traded. But the price is truth and the price is humility, and that's never a good trade. So, these few things I mentioned just now about not allowing fear to influence you, to not be afraid to speak what God wants you to speak, to walk with God in utter truth and humility and not trade truth and humility. I believe all of these things would fall into God's will for His people. This thing about not being afraid to speak what God wants you to speak, can I be honest? Do you know, personally, I find that to be hard to do at a church gathering. An environment in which I would have thought would be one of the most comfortable places for a Christian to speak something God might want them to speak, I find that very difficult. I find that very difficult at times, especially if your thing that God wants you to speak is not like sugar and spice and everything nice. And it's not even that it's like fire and brimstone either. It's like just maybe slight exhortation, slight, maybe ever so slight correction, but not really pointing fingers at any particular person, but just in general, like a general, gentle steer, correctional steer, you know what I mean? Like, I find speaking that in a church environment very difficult. I think that's sad. I think it's for many reasons. Besides the many reasons that could be in me that makes that difficult, I think it is also difficult because there is a general form in a church that feels uncomfortable. Speaking of comfort, I was talking a lot about comfort in the first two parts of this series, but there is a form and different expectations of what happens in a church gathering, a form. And to go outside of that form in any way, I find uncomfortable. That shouldn't keep me from doing it, but I mean, I think first of all, there are certain guidelines outlined in the Bible for what may go on in a church service. So let's abide by that. But I think there are perhaps unspoken but known rules made by man that also go on in a church service. And when those types of man-made boundaries are there, it is difficult to push through that, because I know what they are. I know what the boundaries are, even if they're unspoken. I know you're not supposed to do this at certain times, and you're not supposed to do that at certain times. And even in the time that you might be allowed to speak, you maybe shouldn't say certain things. There is no printed instruction manual for etiquette in church services that I know of, but it's unspoken, but everybody knows them. You know what I'm saying? So that's one reason why I can find it not easy to speak what God may want me to speak. Another reason why, and I'm trying to not allow this to influence me unduly, I mean, consider other people in things you do, but not to the point where it causes you to disobey God. What I'm getting at is, I know certain things I might say might rub people maybe a little bit the wrong way. I am most aware of this. I am most aware. But either do you say what God wants you to say, or do you not, because you're concerned too much about other people. I'm not saying disregard other people. I'm saying put that priority. I'm saying put the importance of that under your importance of obeying God. Put the importance of obeying God above that, that's all. And I'm not saying I got everything together. I'm not saying I am exactly who God wants me to be yet. I'm growing. So what I'm saying is, that can still be something not easy for me to speak what God wants me to speak, even though it may rub people the wrong way. It's one thing to speak it into the camera like this. You know, I don't have to see people's disgruntled faces looking back at me. I don't have to feel cold shoulders. I don't have to deal with people's commentary when I'm speaking into the camera like this. But it's a little different in person. Honestly, it is. And you know, some of the people that you see almost every single week at church, you start to like a little bit. You start to like a little bit, you start to care about a little bit, and you don't exactly feel like making their Sunday morning uncomfortable. By what? By something you said. Still, I cannot allow that to make me not speak what God may want me to speak. So what was my point? My point is, it is not always easy, but I'm encouraging you, I'm encouraging myself to not be afraid to speak what God wants you to speak, to the point of not speaking it. You might be a little afraid, but still, if God is telling you to speak it, speak it. And again, not just in speaking, but be aware of when fear is trying to influence you in the many ways it tries to. In many different ways, fear can influence a person to do something not very good. I think there's a difference between acting in fear and acting in wisdom. So may we act in wisdom and common sense and not in fear. Furthermore, I touched a little bit upon walking with God in truth and humility. Truth and humility, and how we shouldn't trade those things, and how much will be offered in trade. What would be offered in trade for truth? All kinds of things. Maybe you can think of some things that could be offered in trade for truth. And you would probably think of some things that would be offered in trade for humility as well, such as keeping face, keeping some sort of reputation, but it's not a good trade for humility. There's a Bible verse, something about that pride comes before destruction. Pride comes before destruction, and I believe a haughty spirit or haughtiness or something like that before a fall. Before I heard someone read that verse recently, I thought it was pride comes before a fall. But apparently it actually says pride comes before destruction, and destruction to me sounds worse than a fall. It's one thing to fall, it's another thing for destruction to come. So maybe that is good to remember in terms of how we should stay away from pride, because it's not going to have a good result for us. Anyway, yes, measuring your days as these days progress, whatever days we have left here. I hope that we keep that in mind, to know that our days are measured. So let us use them for the purposes of God. And we can be assured that when we do so, it's going to be worth it. It's not going to be in vain. I don't think we're going to be standing there in front of God, seeing Him face to face, and have some regret, like, oh, I really wish I lived that earthly life for myself a little more. I don't think it's going to be like that at all. If we remember much of our earthly life at that point when we're standing in front of God, I think it will become even more clear how small that was. How temporal it really was. Maybe that's something to pray for, that as we live out the rest of these days, maybe that is something to ask the Lord for, that we would have a truer and truer perspective of the temporal and the eternal, and to ask the Lord to help us value what He values and not what He doesn't. I already pray that regularly, that the Lord would help me and other specific people that I pray for, that the Lord would help us to value what He values and not what He doesn't. I also pray that He would help us to see things in His perspective more. Anyway, I think that's all for this video. Lord willing, I will see you in the next one.